Now, taking the discussions forward, we should study in depth the concept of gross domestic product. We have seen earlier also that gross domestic product is nothing but the sum total of the products and services produced during a year or during a fiscal in terms of monetary units. That is, when we measure the whole basket of products and services that are produced in the economy, usually a year, then that GDP amount can be arrived at, and the total market value of all goods and services produced within the territorial boundary of a country using domestic resources during a given period of time is usually referred to as a gross domestic product. But at the same time, this has to be understood in the context of varying price lines that are existing in the economy, and there is another concept of gross national income. Gross national income at market prices is equal to GDP at market prices plus taxes and less subsidies on production and the imports plus the compensation of employees net receivables from abroad, because there are some people who will be working abroad, there will be some people of foreign origin who will be working in India. So, all these things have to be netted to arrive at the gross national income, that is the domestic production plus those who are working abroad, that is the income earned by Indians abroad minus the income earned by the foreigners in India. So, if you net all of them, then you get the gross national income. But in the context of understanding, GDP is more important as a concept, so that we are able to understand the whole dynamics of how it is computed. Gross national income, in a way, we can briefly say that GDP plus or minus those incomes which are earned abroad or which are earned by foreigners in India, so that it gives us a big picture of how the gross national income is computed in India. And it is interesting to understand that there is a difference between the GDP and the gross national product. Gross national product, as I have already discussed, that removes the element of foreigners working in India and Indians working abroad. That gives us a net position, and that gives us the correct composition of income earned by the Indian community in India and abroad. That gives us a net position, and GNP will be more than GDP naturally, unless those foreigners working in India are much more and their income levels are much more, then only it goes in the negative side. Otherwise, normally GNP is more than GDP, because it gives a netting impact, GDP plus the non-resident outflows and inflows. There are various ways of computing the GDP, and one way is to compute from the expenditure point of view, that is calculating total expenditure of all entities which are operating in the economy. That is one factor. Then another factor is the income, that is calculating the total income received from all sectors, and then evaluating the product wise production, so that you are able to get a comprehensive picture of the GDP that has operated in a given point of time. So, in a way we can say that we should take into account the income, the expenditure and the total output cost, so that we are in a position to arrive at the numbers in terms of GDP. And GDP is always an aggregate measure. Why it is an aggregate measure? Because there are various elements that form part of the GDP, and it does not speak anything about how the GDP is distributed among the population of the country, because there are islands of productions, and the entire geographical domain is spread across. So it does not speak about the areas from which it originates. Of course, we have state-wise GDP data and other aspects, but at the same time, when we talk about the GDP of the country and the rate of growth of GDP, then we always refer to the holistic number, that is the sum total. Higher GDP does not necessarily imply higher welfare, because naturally, since it is a disjointed activity, in one part of the country the GDP can be very high, in another part of the country it can be very low, or it is not evenly distributed, and as such we cannot always say that the welfare is evenly distributed. It depends on the distribution pattern, but the rise in GDP is always a positive sign, because it gives a comfort, and it also raises the standard of the country as a whole in terms of GDP. Though welfare wise it is a wider concept which encompasses development in all aspects of the society, which includes health, sanitation, standard of living, per capita income, and the infrastructure, and the status of distribution of the income within various groups of the economy, and it gives a very wide dispensation as far as distribution of the income is concerned. Hence, GDP is always to be looked upon with reference to the Human Development Index, where we are trailing far behind even in Asia. So we have to look at the GDP as one broad indicator of growing economy, but at the same time the disparities among different classes of the economy cannot be taken as properly distributed. So we will have to always keep in mind that GDP is only an indicator of how much is built during a fiscal, but at the same time its distribution pattern depends on the peculiarities of the different geographical regions and the state policies and the infrastructure that is built in different states of the economy. So we should always keep in mind that GDP is an aggregate measure, and it does not speak about the distribution of welfare of the economy. It has to be looked upon with reference to the various human development efforts that are made. And when we come to the types of GDP, there are various types of GDP. GDP at current prices, GDP at a base year price. So real GDP is calculated by tracking the volume or quantity of production after removing the influencing change in the prices due to inflation. So we should always keep in mind that at any given point of time, the GDP, whether it is at the base price or whether it is at the current price. So the current price consists of inflation due to the rise in the cost price index and the wholesale price index, that is WPI and CPI. These factors have to be kept in mind in making an assessment of the real GDP. And nominal GDP at current prices represents the total money value expressed in terms of the market prices of each year. It is the value of today's output at today's price. So we have these two options, a real GDP at the base year price, a nominal GDP at the current price. So these numbers will give us an indication of how the inflation is moving in the economy and how it is affecting the real GDP, because when we are factoring the output in terms of inflation, then we get the real numbers. In an emerging economy like India, where the inflation is always at between 5 to 6%, it is always necessary to factor the inflation to arrive at the nominal GDP, and it helps read the right trend in the growth of the GDP. So we should understand both the concepts of real GDP and the nominal GDP to get a fair view of how the prices are moving and how the inflation is affecting the movement of the GDP in the economy.